and welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read books and steal them too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah, and I am just so thrilled to welcome back onto the podcast Andrew Cartmel to talk about his new book, Death in Fine Condition, the first, I hope it's the first, in the Paperback Sleuth series.
It's great to be here. And if anybody's wondering about the theft reference in Lily's introduction, it's very pertinent to the plot of my book, which is the first of a series. I can assure you that because I was very busy writing book 2 today and recently.
Oh, good.
Delightful.
Good. Well, that's my good thing that happened this week, was finding that out just now. Also, I got my passport.
Congrats.
I was very worried it wouldn't come because everything's very slow right now.
Sure.
But I got it. It came in the mail. I can stop worrying about it.
It's a lovely feeling.
How about you, Andrew? What's something great that happened this week?
Wow. Okay, so I mentioned that I'm working on the second Paperback Sleuth novel, and I had a great idea for it. I mean, like it was flowing along, but it needed something, and I thought, oh, how can I possibly deal with that? Because when you become a more experienced writer, you sort of see the bumps in the road before you hit them, and you think, and I suddenly saw something I could do that was really simple, that would help the whole book, and I really loved it. And sometimes I always have a certain number of words I write a day, but sometimes I give myself a day off just for having a really good idea. And I didn't give myself a day off for this, but I could have done. It was that good an idea. So that was a really nice thing that happened this week, because my head's so much in my work and my book, and it may sound a bit kind of dull for me to be, but that's what I'm focused on. So it was a great thing in that. My garden's also looking really great this week. I mean, so if somebody wanted a sort of slightly more human response, that's the garden is looking fantastic. I've planted lots of lovely stuff in it this week.
Awesome. How about you, Sarah?
My good thing is that I made candied lemon slices this week, and they're delicious. It's pretty impossible to eat just one. So yeah, I think I'm going to use up some more lemons making more of those.
We used to have this wonderful Portuguese delicatessen in West London. I don't think it's there anymore, but one of their specialties was indeed candied fruit peel. So I totally know what that's like, and it sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it's really nice. You get the sourness of the lemon, but it's contrasted with the sweetness of the sugar and the sugar water that it's been soaked in, cooking in. And it's really nice.
Is it just those two ingredients, the sugar and the peel?
So it's actually a whole slice. It's not just the peel. So you have the meat of the lemon too, because I use Meyer lemons, which are pretty sweet. And you boil them or simmer them for 15 minutes in what is essentially a simple syrup. So water and sugar.
Yeah, fantastic.
And that's it. Yeah. Very simple.
Wonderful.
Awesome. You're going to mail some to me, right?
Or you can come and pick them up.
Just a quick 15-hour drive.
It's only a 2-hour flight. You could do that.
Yeah. Well, what is everyone drinking this afternoon/evening, depending on your continent?
Oh, I'm particularly glad you asked. I'm afraid this is quite a long explanation. Is that permitted?
Of course.
Absolutely.
Right. So I'm a hopeless drug addict, but luckily the drug I'm hopelessly addicted to is drinking chocolate. So I love, if I said it was hot chocolate, people would imagine silly things with marshmallows in, but I've got all kinds of gourmet, high-end, high cocoa content hot chocolates. And I drink that throughout the day, various kinds of that. But when I reach a certain point in the evening, I stop drinking that just because it's a little too much calories, a little too much milk and richness. And I move on to something which you've probably never heard of, because I never heard of it before, which is cacao shell tea. So just to give you an idea what this is, I actually have to read. It says, to make chocolate, we have to roast each and every cocoa bean to a certain time and temperature to get the best flavor. Then we crack the beans and take the shells off, separating the inside of the bean nib from the outside shell. And then you can make tea from the shell. Oh. So what you do is I just have an infuser, and then I serve it with sugar. I use coconut sugar because that's what these people recommend, and they're great. This is a boutique chocolate maker in London called I'll just mention that, Lucoco. And so when I'm winding down towards the end of the day, after drinking lots of hot chocolate, I have this cacao shell tea, and it's really great.
That sounds amazing. I might see if I can get some shipped out, or a quick 15-hour flight.
No, but I mean, you're very welcome. But I'm sure that somewhere in America you certainly source the coconut sugar and the cacao shells probably too. And then it's just all you need is a tea infuser, and you're off to the races.
Yeah, I'm gonna Google that right now, actually, which is not great podcasting, but I don't care.
No, but you see, the thing is, unlike tea, or it's the same reason I like drinking hot chocolate, drinking chocolate instead of coffee, because the caffeine takes my head off in tea as well. So this is like in the same way that drinking chocolate is a much mellower hit than coffee. This is a much mellower hit than tea.
Interesting.
I hope the mic caught the sound of me slurping contentedly there. Cacao shell tea.
Oop, I've accidentally stumbled into all of the health conditions that it will miraculously cure.
Oh, well, it's certainly good for your morale. So,
Yes.
I mean, and the mind and body being intimately connected, it probably is good for some stuff.
Well, it sounds delicious, and I'm definitely going to hunt some down.
And I didn't just drink it so I'd have an interesting answer to your question, because I knew you were going to ask me that question. Because I figured, I'll just tell them about the latest drinking chocolate I had. But then, like I said, recently, it's because I'm working so much. I like to, how people like to have a cup of coffee when they're working, they'll drink lots of coffee. Well, I do that with the drinking chocolate. But as I say, I've usually have a cutoff point, then I move on to the tea. So because I've been working so intensively on my books lately, I've started drinking this stuff again. So by a lucky coincidence, I had an interesting answer to that question.
It definitely was an interesting answer. And like Lily, I think I'm going to have to find some of this.
You may have to edit that down to half an hour. That discussion around drinking. Sorry about that, folks. But it's good stuff. So if anybody out there wants to try it, I mean, it's not just me gloating. It's a good ad for the stuff.
Well, my answer is not nearly so interesting. Just iced tea. Black iced tea.
I used to love iced tea. When I was a kid, we used to get, was it Lipton's, in a can? And, I did adore it.
Yeah, it's so good. And especially on a hot day, it just feels nice.
Yeah.
How about you, Sarah?
Is apparently World Whiskey Day.
Ooh.
Or for the listener, it will not be. But for us, as we are recording, it is. I'm not drinking whiskey because it is only noon. But I am drinking black tea out of my Highland Park mug, which is the northernmost Scotch distillery, I believe.
And you're a single malt fan, aren't you, Sarah?
I am, yes. Yes.
If I was drinking whiskey, I've forsworn drinking booze totally these days. But if I was to drink spirits, I would drink single malts because I remember back when I did drink, it was great because you get all these different kinds. It's so fascinating, and the different subtleties of flavors. It's like drinking wine. You look at the regions and how they make it and everything. It's really great stuff.
Yeah, and I love it. But like I said, it is noon, so a little early.
It's a little early in the day for whiskey.
Well, other than the excellent novel we're about to discuss, has anyone read anything good lately?
Again, I'm so glad you asked that now, because I had a pretty good answer lined up, just as with the drink. But then I've got a great answer, which just came out of nowhere. I like to do this thing where when I'm interested in an artist, like a writer or something, if I can get a biography of them and then read it alongside the work, I love to do that. So I've been doing that with Somerset Maugham. I've been doing it with David Lynch, because I've had a David Lynch revival, and he wrote a great autobiography. But I've also been doing it with Noel Coward. And I just read this play by Noel Coward that I'd never heard of. It's called The Marquise. I might be pronouncing that wrong, but it's a term for a French noblewoman. And it's totally not what you imagine Noel Coward to be, which is sort of like cocktails and people smart set in London in the 20s. It's 18th century France. And it's a fantastic romantic comedy. It's just perfect. Like, I write plays myself, and when I see one that's just perfectly executed, and it's elegant, not in the sense of being like elegant nobility. It's elegant in the sense of the way a mathematical equation can be elegant, in that it's perfectly lean and spare, and it just does its job beautifully. And I literally just finished reading that because I'd reached the point in the Noel Coward biography where it said his next play was The Marquise. And I thought, well, I'll read about it before I read the spoilers in the biography. And it was so good. And you can sort of see it arising out of his other work. It's got such fantastic character, and it's so funny, and it's so deftly written. And I'd never heard of it. That's the thing and it's so not what you think of Noel Coward as being. So I'm really high on that. Occasionally you stumble across a play like that. Like I found a Tennessee Williams play that I'd never heard of before, and I was just knocked out by its brilliance. So I love discovering these new things.
Fantastic. It's always the best when you find something that you weren't expecting. It makes it almost better than if you were anticipating a good book.
Yeah, especially when it's by a writer that you thought you knew quite well.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, have you read anything good lately?
I've read a lot about Vanderpump Rules. which
I
is
don't know what that is.
Yeah.
it's so Vanderpump Rules is a reality TV show that's, I think, just finished up the 10th season. And I don't normally watch it, but I have a couple of friends who are really into reality TV shows. And this season in particular, there's been this huge cheating scandal between two of the cast members that has like rocked the entire fandom. And reading about it has been oddly compelling. So I've spent a lot of time reading Variety articles and People articles about the Scandival.
What does Vanderpump Rules mean?
I think it's a spin-off of one of the like Real Housewife shows. Lisa Vanderpump, I believe, was one of the cast members of Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. Right. And it's about people who work as waiters and waitresses, as staff members in one of her bars that she owns in LA.
So does rules mean like a set of regulations, or does it mean like she rules because she's great?
I have no idea. I've only watched a handful.
I was about to ask, have you still not seen any of it and are just absorbing content? Because that would have been very funny.
I've watched one episode of this current season, and I've watched a handful of episodes of like the first season when I was visiting friends who wanted to watch it. But no, I have not watched a lot of it because I'm not really a reality TV show person.
No, you wanted to be across it because your friends are all talking about it.
Yeah. And like I said, the scandal is oddly compelling. I feel really bad for the woman who was cheated on, but yeah.
Well, I read a terrible article. I got tricked by clickbait. I should have known better. It was like 6 foods this nutritionist refuses to eat and what they say you should eat instead. So I was like, yeah, okay, sure. Let's find out. And the first one was hot dogs. And I was like, I get it. Not super healthy. But the what you should eat instead was tofu. Cool. That's not even kind of the same thing. And then the second on the list were hamburgers. And you know what you should eat instead of hamburgers?
Tofu?
Also tofu.
I see. I can see where this is going.
Yeah. So that was a waste of time. I like tofu. It's not the same thing as a hot dog.
I'm a sucker for those articles too, though.
What if it's interesting? Sometimes it is. This one was not. All right. A book that was interesting that I did enjoy reading was Death in Fine Condition.
Bless you.
Yes, it was fantastic. But it is very different from the series that you have been writing, your Vinyl Detective series.
That was, I mean, it had to be different because there's no point doing something that's exactly the same. But at the same time, that was a worry because I want to inherit a lot of the readers of the Vinyl Detective. I don't want to alienate them. But she's in the Vinyl Detective, you've got, for all the horrible things that happen, your heroes are quite kind of shining and valiant and unbesmirched, which you can't say about the heroine of this book.
Not at all. I think when we were writing our notes, Lily made a comment that the Vinyl Detective series is kind of like the PG-13 version, and Death in Fine Condition, or the Paperback Sleuth, is definitely the R-rated.
Oh, that's very interesting and true. Although I would say that a friend who sort of reads all my stuff and gives me feedback, she felt that the last Vinyl Detective, which was called Attack and Decay, she thought that was quite R-rated too. So maybe that was just sort of the phase of the moon when I wrote those books.
Well, like you said, though, there are some sort of gruesome moments. There is violence in the Vinyl Detective, but it is always sort of separate. Whereas in, I don't know, Cordelia gets up to some hijinks in this book.
I'm really glad you guys liked it. It's a tremendous relief because the book is about to come out. I'm looking at the date today in about 3 weeks' time. So we will find out. I mean, I've had some advance reports, obviously, but we'll find out what the world at large thinks of it. So I've got my fingers very much crossed.
Yeah, I believe, if my recollection of when we scheduled this episode to come out is correct, I believe that the book will have just come out.
Of course. Yeah.
I think this episode is supposed to come out the Wednesday after.
Great. So the book, for people who are listening at some distant point, should come out around the 6th of June, 2023.
What was it like writing in a somewhat similar genre, but with such a different tone?
Okay, so it was initially really difficult I made certain basic decisions off the bat, which were fairly straightforward because for anyone who's not familiar with it, The Vinyl Detective is a first-person narrative, which means I did this, I did that. You're always inside the guy's head. And it's got a male protagonist and he has cats. And also he's in a settled kind of loving relationship. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to do a first-person narrative. I'll do what they call a close third person, which is she did this, she did that, but you're sort of inside her head. Like Cordelia was very worried about what would happen, but nevertheless, she kept going. So you're inside her head, but you're also outside it. Close third person. It's got a female protagonist instead of a male protagonist. She's a free agent and sort of doesn't believe in happy ever after romance. She's a bit more cynical than that. And she likes dogs instead of cats. I mean, some of this is very mechanical kind of flipping of the tropes. But I liked all those things. So those were kind of basic decisions early on. And also the fact that our hero in The Vinyl Detective is a bit of a Raymond Chandler. You know, he's sort of a knight errant, by which I mean he's sort of heroic and chivalric, although not in a boring, obvious way, but he's got genuine values and is a straight arrow. She's not, right? She's a much more compromised character. And I knew she was going to be, and I decided very early on to signal this and reinforce it by making her the sister of the guy who's basically the bad guy in Vinyl Detective books. He's not the bad guy in the sense of the villain or the murderer, but he's sort of the hero's nemesis. He's sort of this kind of horrible, he's like the guy who's always been obstructive to you in your career and has always been a pain in the ass. That's Stinky Stanmer. So this is Cordelia Stanmer.
You mentioned that this book is in third person, but like one thing that I really appreciated about it is that the narration so clearly has Cordelia's voice. You really get a sense of who she is as a person and what she values, which is basically just books and weed.
It definitely has her attitude all the way through. That's right. The fact that it's third person does not in any way make it detached or objective. It's totally from the point of view, because it's fun to make the narration part of the entertainment. You could just, I suppose, if you're Hemingway, for instance, you would tell the story very boldly, and the language would be very plain, but the incidents and the character and the dialogue would sort of provide you with the fun. Well, hopefully that you get fun from all that in this book, but also from the narration, which is in itself hopefully a bit of an entertainment.
Oh, absolutely. When Cordelia is contemplating a book that she really, or a set of books that she really wants, and convincing herself that if you think about it, they already belong to her because she wants them more than the owner does. That was just much fun.
That is her very flexible morality. And she does, in fact, steal a bunch of books. And that's sort of the trigger for a load of stuff, a lot of violence and mayhem that happens because she's stolen them from the wrong guy. That was a very early decision, that she would steal some books and that she would steal them from somebody who turns out to be a really dangerous gangster. Because, that's quite a cool situation. But in a sense, Cordelia subscribes to the morality of a guy called Dashiell Hammett, who's one of my heroes. Great crime writer, a big influence in The Vinyl Detective and everything I've written. And it's just one of the things that he said that stuck in my mind forever. He said, things belong to those who want them most. Now, I'm not arguing for the truth of that, but it's certainly a potent notion, and it's certainly one that Cordelia would subscribe to.
Well, Cordelia and I are the same in that way, because my great book heist when I was 8 years old was liberating a book that none of my classmates would have been able to appreciate. So it belonged with me instead.
I totally get that. I'm not going to confess to anything on record, but I totally sympathize with that.
I think the difference there is that Lily was 8. Cordelia is not 8.
It also was not a particularly valuable paperback.
Just so people who may or may not be familiar with it, The Vinyl Detective, the MacGuffins in those books are invariably records, usually rare and valuable records. So I've very shamelessly done the same thing, a similar thing in this, by making it valuable and rare vintage paperbacks. And the reason for that is because I'm really interested in records and I'm really interested in vintage paperbacks. So obviously I chose to write about the things that I love and which fascinate me.
Well, you just answered the question that we had, which was how much research did you have to do for the book stuff? I guess the answer is none because you know most of it.
Well, that's the low-hanging fruit principle, and it's certainly a very useful thing, and I recommend it to anybody because it overlaps with the most important dictum of writing a good novel is to write about what you love, which is always obviously going to be something that you know. So that did help. I mean, I have had to do research, and I quite love doing now that back in the days when you had to actually get up and go to a library and look stuff up, I wasn't very hard on research. And my friend Ben Aronovich, the best-selling novelist, always used to sort of tease me and castigate me for that. But as soon as the internet arrived, he sort of acknowledges that I'm happy to do. As soon as research became easy, I became a big advocate of research.
Well, we've mentioned the Vinyl Detective series a couple of times, and we do see some familiar faces in this book. Can you tell us about sort of balancing those references to bring in existing readers without potentially alienating a new audience?
Well, I decided quite early on that the two series, the Vinyl Detective and the Paperback Sleuth, should operate in the same universe and therefore should share some characters. And obviously, once I decided that Cordelia was the sister of Stinky, that became built into it. But then I began to see I sort of needed, besides the great paperback heist, as I like to think about it, I needed some other sort of engines to drive my narrative. And for some reason, at a very early stage, because I'm going to say here that Cordelia is bisexual, but she's not, because she wouldn't accept that label. I mean, she would laugh heartily at the notion, that term would be like some kind of Victorian term. She just, if she fancies someone and they want to sleep with her, she'll sleep with them, but she just doesn't see these distinctions. So she is what an old-fashioned person might call bisexual. So I thought it would be really interesting if the object of her passionate crush, like she has this obsession is not too strong a word, with a character from the Vinyl Detective novels, which is Agatha Dubois Keynes. And part of the reason for that is that Agatha is the object of a similar doomed obsession for one of the characters in the Vinyl Detective novel. So it was sort of fun to port that over into this book. But also, I quite often like to think that I'm writing a novel in the tradition of another kind of novel. So, for instance, some of the Vinyl Detective books, I've emulated great crime writers like Low Action, for instance, is very much an Agatha Christie novel. But in the case of the Paperback Sleuth, I was thinking about Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, which is this incredible novel of erotic obsession and passion. And I suddenly thought, yeah, it should have some of that in it. Because one of the things about Lolita is that it's a very funny book. I mean, it's a very dark and disturbing book, but it's also in love with language. And the obsession the hero has with Lolita is carried over into the narrative. Like there's a bit in Lolita where it just says, Lolita, Lolita, Lolita. Publisher, just repeat this across the entire page, which obviously hasn't been done. But it's so hilarious because he's obsessed, but he's not obsessed enough to actually type it all those times. He just expects somebody else to. It's such a great joke, right? So it's that kind of thing. And so I sort of wanted to bring a bit of that to it. And also I thought I could write that erotic obsession effectively because I have that model of Nabokov's in my mind. I'm not saying that that's the main thing in this book, but that was just one of the ingredients when I was in the kitchen cooking it up.
Do you think that now that the Paperback Sleuth is out in the world and published, do you have any intention to kind of bring some of those characters back into the Vinyl Detective as hints, or?
Yes, absolutely. Because in the course of the Paperback Sleuth novel, Death in Fine Condition, our heroine Cordelia does have an affair with my character, Jordan Tinkler. And part of the reason that they get together is they both have a hopeless crush on the same woman. And so sort of for want of better, they come together and they have what young folk might call a situationship, because it doesn't quite qualify as a relationship. But that means that the characters in the Vinyl Detective world will be aware, not only that Tinkler's been seeing this woman, but she's Stinky Stanmer's sister, which is like a big thing for them. So that's going to come up in the next Vinyl Detective novel, which I wanted to mention to anybody who's a huge Vinyl Detective fan. Number one, thank you. And number two, don't be worried because we've just finalizing a contract for 2 more Vinyl Detective novels.
Oh, that's wonderful news.
Thank you. It is. And 2 more Paperback Sleuth novels. The publisher has decided to go for 2 more in each series. So if you like either or both series, you're secure for a few more books at least.
So That answers my question. You sort of see these as maybe parallel stories, not one and then the other, right? Like you're not moving from the Vinyl Detective to the Paperback Sleuth.
They all sort of coexist at the same time. The more that I can interweave them, the more fun it is. And also it kind of, because I'm the world's laziest man, it sort of saves work in a way. So for instance, in the course of the Paperback Sleuth novel, Death in Fine Condition, I have to keep saying that because there's so many books floating around. There's the books I've finished, the books I'm working on. So in the course of this book, which we're here to talk about, I needed her to as a little subplot, to have another book that she was looking for, not the main book, but some other book. And I thought, you know what? I've got this book that was a MacGuffin in Vinyl Detective novel. In Attack and Decay, there was this character in Sweden who wrote this really bad Nordic noir, and he self-published it, right? And then the author of this book was horribly murdered in exactly the manner this is a bit of a spoiler, in exactly the manner that's described in this rubbish book that he's written. So I thought, obviously it's a self-published book and it had no success. I thought, well, wouldn't it be really interesting if that book began to get some traction, became like a collector's item? And that's not really a story to be told in the Vinyl Detective novel, which is about music and records, but it's ideal for the Paperback Sleuth. So I've got this little kind of subplot going on about this book, which is called Cold Angel, Dead Angel, which is like the most, it's not a bad title, but it's the most sort of melodramatic title I could come up with. And the thing is, I think that's going to be such a lovely little Easter egg and bonus for anybody who enjoyed the Vinyl Detective novel. And hopefully it's not too baffling an oddity for somebody who's not familiar with it. I did actually stick in a footnote in case people thought, why do you keep banging on about this strange little book? It actually says, by the way, this book features in the Vinyl Detective novel number 6. So I love doing those overlaps. And I think other people do kind of, if they like both series, they'll appreciate those little crossovers.
I think my favorite reference to the Vinyl Detective series is actually at one point, the artist that Cordelia is talking to, Toba, mentions that she has commissions and that there's one commission in particular that she's very behind on, painting a picture of these people's cats. And I was like, I like that.
Thank you so much, because that's a reference back to Victory Disc. I wondered if anybody would get that, because Toba Posner is this artist, and she's a major element in that story, that Vinyl Detective story. And at a certain point, out of gratitude, she promises to do a portrait of our hero and his girlfriend's 2 cats. And I thought, well, you know what? That painting has never actually appeared in the Vinyl Detective series. So what the hell's going on? Because I think I would have mentioned it. I thought, you know what? If she's like anybody else, any other creative artist, she's probably way behind. And you know how it is? The more you sort of promised something to somebody and then you don't do it, the more it becomes like a thing that you can't get around to doing. Like you can't quite face the fact that you haven't done it. So that's her deal with that. And I'm so glad, Sarah, that you spotted that. That really makes it all worthwhile, because that was a really subtle, that wasn't signposted. That was a very subtle reference.
Yeah, I think that was I have to say that was my favorite reference.
It's so gratifying to know that because you put these little things in and think, they're like bottles with messages thrown into the ocean. You wonder if anybody will ever get them, and it's so great that you did.
My favorite crossover was how everyone hates Stinky, and that is just the universal truth, no matter what series you're in. And I do too. He deserves it.
I was just about to say, you shouldn't feel sorry, because he does do it. He comes in and he's so terrible to her. And I thought, my God, things he says are just unspeakable. And I thought, should I soften it? I thought, no, probably not. Because the point is, he's saying these terribly offensive things, but they'll only make the reader more on the side of Cordelia, I think. Mm-hmm. Because he's being so horrible to her. And also, that's sort of what Stinky does. I mean, Stinky kind of has this shtick in my books that he comes on, usually when he's least expected and least wanted, and he just starts talking. His voice is so clear in my head. He's so narcissistic, and he's so in love with his own sort of like hip street jargon. And he just says this stuff, which is so revealing of the third-rateness of his soul. So I love writing him. I really do.
He's one of those people that you really love to hate.
He's a very useful character, and maybe I'll do something interesting with him, like make him seem... Actually, I did do that. I've already done that in one book where you probably end up feeling sorry for Stinky because he's so terribly frightened that he actually soils himself in one book. You sort of think, oh, poor old... And in fact, our heroes say, oh, poor old Stinky, and they feel sorry about him. But the other thing is, Stinky needed some minders. Now, minder is a British word for sort of bodyguard or personal assistant, right? And I suddenly thought, well, I've got those guys ready made in Attack and Decay. I had these two characters called Rod and Rod, who I think we might have discussed because there's a great spoiler about their names, for instance. Anyway, Rod and Rod, who are these kind of matching hulking ex-special forces bodyguards. I thought they're great. They can be Stinky, and they're very useful in the plot of this book. And I think they're going to be useful in other Paperback Sleuth novels. So I love being able to carry these characters over. It's really enriched the experience for me. I hope it does for the readers.
Did you have a favorite character to bring over into this setting?
Tinkler is always really great fun and really useful, but in a sort of horrible way, I've sort of got to say Stinky, because he's just so much fun to write. And it's kind of shocking, but also wonderful to discover he's actually got a family, because he's such a horrible person. He sort of can't imagine his family. And so I had to start, okay, I can see why his sister is a bit like the way she is, because he's her brother, right? So that sort of accounts for that. But I had to start thinking about their parents. And that's been quite an interesting exercise. So, for instance, I now know that her dad is like obsessed with pulp television. That's why she's called Cordelia, because she's named after Cordelia Chase and Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
I love that. I didn't know that.
Thank you. Well, I sort of thought Cordelia's an odd name. And I sort of thought, wonder where I got it. I thought it might have been from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I thought, but that's actually great. And so in the next book, she actually mentions this, and she says, she didn't mind being called Cordelia. She felt she was quite fortunate not to have been called Charisma, because, of course, Charisma Carpenter is the actress who plays Cordelia. So it's, yeah. And I love that the way that, again, that sort of makes the world a little bit richer.
I love that it sounds like we might be getting to learn more about Cordelia and Stinky and their family, because I really, like you say, it makes sense that Cordelia is the way she is if she grew up with a Stinky who consistently acted towards her like he does in the one scene in this book, which was, boy, poor Cordelia.
As I say, I wondered if I'd gone too far. I thought, no, let's just go to the limit. Mel Brooks has saying that if you step up to the bell, ring it. Otherwise, don't step up to the bell. So that's in relation to doing Springtime for Hitler and the producers. They were saying, can you actually do this? He said, yeah, we stepped up to the bell, we got to ring it. So I sort of did that with Stinky in that. Yeah, and when you start thinking of these people as people, it's always a fascinating procedure, and it can only make them more realistic and more rounded, even though they don't have to become more likable necessarily, but they become more comprehensible at least.
Well, I definitely found Cordelia in particular very charming and likable, even while she's doing some kind of awful things. There was actually a moment in the book where I had to stop and go, oh, she's not very nice, is she?
Oh dear.
It took me an embarrassingly long time to pick up on that.
Oh, but did you come away with a net feeling that you liked her, that she wasn't very nice?
Oh, I liked her. And so realizing that she's not very nice, despite how much I liked her, was like Do
you remember what the bit was where you thought that?
Yeah, when she just goes to Agatha's house and sits outside of it for like multiple hours. That was the moment where I was like, okay.
She thought because she was getting a bit stalky.
Yeah, but it totally fits for her character. It didn't make me dislike her. It just made me sort of examine the fact that I like her despite her doing these strange things.
That's an interesting scene. I don't know if we should save it for the spoilers, but what I liked is there's a bit in it where there's a fantastic sort of bit of illusion or delusion in it, which I thought came off really well. I'm sure we can discuss that more in the spoiler-laden section. But the thing about when you're writing the first book about a character, it takes a while to find them. So what I actually did with Cordelia was I did a likability pass, because the way she turned out in the first pass was she was just too unlikable. So I only had to change about half a dozen things. And often they were quite small things, like maybe a sentence here and there. And it flipped her over to making her a much more likable person. And it was an important and valuable thing to do. And then the editor at the publisher asked if she could be a bit more likable. And I said, I've already started on that journey. So I totally agree with you. So I was happy to do a little more like that, because I don't think she ended up softened. And although we mentioned that she became sort of unwholesomely obsessed, she does get over it, which I thought was a really important and valuable thing. Like she has this crazed passion, but it kind of burns itself out, which I thought was realistic and healthy.
Mm-hmm. One more topic before we can jump into the spoiler section. But one thing that really struck me about this book is how tense it is. Even when we're having the like fun, silly stalking scenes, there is always this sense of danger because it opens with a time skip, right? We see the climactic scene at the beginning of the book, and then we get to like 2 months earlier or something like that.
Thank you so much.
Well, I also actually think that the blurb at the back of the book really helps create that sense of tension too, because I know for myself, reading the description of what was going to, or the summary of what was going to happen, I kept waiting for this horrible gangster to do horrible things. And that really amped up the sense of tension I felt as I was reading the book, and things were going pretty well. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that things go okay for Cordelia in the beginning.
That's really good. It's really interesting because one tends to forget that the book is not just the text of the book itself. It arrives in the world with certain stuff around it, including the stuff on the back. And people do read that, and you have to bear that in mind. And I'd never thought of that, but that's great. That's a case of the stuff, the blurb on the back, really helping the book. Because as you say, for a long time, things don't happen. And in fact, my editor took me and my agent out to lunch, and they sat down because they wanted some more chat. I'd done a lot of work on this book. It was really hard work because it was the first one in the series, and I was still finding it. So it took a long, long time and a lot of work. And I was I felt I'd done enough work on it. And they wanted some more work. And one of the things they wanted was that there's a long time before the action and the mayhem begins. And they said there's a long time before the mayhem and the action begins. And I thought, because you can't just restructure the story because that's very difficult. I thought, what if we do this time skip? What if we drop in a page and a half at the beginning of the most gruesome moment in the book, and then we know it's coming. and everybody's really happy with that. Most of all me, because it saves so much heartache. But it worked. Thank you for saying that it works, because I was very, very happy with that, because it's like that Alfred Hitchcock gave this example of a sequence in a film. So a guy's driving along in his car, and he's driving along, and people see him and wave to him, and he stops at these traffic lights, and this cop stops him, and then he waves him on, and then there's a red light. It's the most boring sequence in the world. And he says, "Now, do the same sequence, except you see the guy take a dead body out, put it in the trunk of the car, and then he's driving along." So suddenly everything is imbued with this incredible significance. Like when the cop stops him, you're like, you're going nuts. So it's a little bit like that, because you know that something like that is in the offing. So it's interesting the way it casts an aura over the entire narrative.
Well, I think it's time for us to discuss all of the secrets we've been dancing around. But first, Sarah, who should read this book?
You should read this book if you want a tense crime story with a main character who is simultaneously endearing, hilarious, and horrible.
Indeed, indeed.
To avoid spoilers, skip to 5750.
We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but wow, I did not see Cordelia and Tinkler hooking up. Did not see that coming.
I was not expecting that at all.
Well, this is a super, super, super spoiler, right? This is like a boxes within boxes, a Russian doll spoiler. And it might be a spoiler of something that never actually happens, but just because you guys are so nice, and you're familiar with the Rivers of London novels, right? So there's a bit where Cordelia's having a bath and she's stoned out of her mind, and the water begins behaving really weirdly. And she calls up Tinkler and he says, "Oh, the same thing was happening to me." And she's like, "Oh yeah, I bet it was." Well, that, if we can pull it off, we're actually going to do a Rivers of London crossover, which will explain why the water was behaving strangely. Like, that's not guaranteed, but I've talked about it with Ben, and if we can work out how to do a crossover, we will do that somewhere down the road.
That is incredible. I absolutely adore that idea.
So I sort of built that in. I don't think it'll bother anybody, because it's just like this strange stone thing that happens. Because like, it's so silly, because she this is spoiler time, right? So
yes.
she's having this fantasy, and then Tinkler intrudes in it. And like, what's he doing in my fantasy? So she gets on the phone to him to give him a hard time for being in her fantasy, which is, and like, he apologizes as if it's his fault. And then she's like, oh, I'm on the phone. Might as well make it a booty call. Why don't you come over? It was just like that random, which I loved. I thought that's a great way to get the two of them together.
You mentioned doing a likability pass on Cordelia.
Yeah.
Do you remember any of the things that you changed about her?
Absolutely. Like in the first couple of pages of the book, which are the most important pages, she's trying to sneak back into her house without seeing her landlord, but she owes him money. And she knows that if her landlord is hanging around outside the house, his dog will be with him. And she sees this cat go into the yard, so she knows that she's safe because the cat wouldn't go into the yard if the dog was anywhere there. She was like, had a really nasty, it was funny, but a very nasty description of the cat. And I thought, well, I'm going to cut that because she's instantly this person who's being mean about cats. And then when she was in the same sequence, she was hiding, like in case the landlord was on the scene. And this young nanny and her charge, a little kid, walked past and were staring at her while she was hiding. There's some line like, she gave them a good firm fuck off look, and then they hurried away. And it was a good joke. And one of my friends said she really liked that joke. But I thought, you know what? Again, it makes her this rather hard, unlikable person. So just removing a few things like that. And I sort of got into the swing. And also, she did have redeeming characteristics already. I just brought those out more. Like, she loves that dog, her landlord's dog. And she's got this kind of nice relationship. And she's always buying treats for the dog. So I just did a little bit more of that, because then you kind of warm to her for that reason.
Yeah, I actually was really impressed by how much I liked Cordelia, given how much of a not great person she is. Because I feel like it's so easy to make a character who acts the way she does and who is motivated the way that she is. It's so easy to make them just not sympathetic. But I was really rooting for Cordelia the entire time, even as she was, stealing books and being a stalker. And
that's a great relief, because you did say horrible, and I thought, oh dear. But obviously, she was horrible, but in a likable way. That's a relief.
Yes, horrible. I meant that as a compliment.
Yeah.
In this particular case.
The stalker thing is, that's potentially dangerous, but I think it sounds like we walked that line okay, that it was all right in the end.
Yeah, and that scene, it didn't even bother me. That was just the first moment where I had to I don't know. None of the theft stuff even struck me as, oh yeah, she's a morally gray character. That just all flew by totally fine. That was the moment where I was like, she's a very different character from the Vinyl Detective.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because it was personal. The other thing was just material goods, right? The theft was just about things. This was about a person. But the reason I like that scene, and it was based on reality, I was sitting out in my garden one day, and I wasn't stalking anybody. I was just sitting in my garden. And I looked up at this building, which is this tall building across the way. And I thought, oh, there's a white curtain hanging out the window, billowing and I stood up, and it wasn't. There was a plastic bag caught in a tree. And it was nowhere near the building. It was just the way I was sitting, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I put that in that scene where she's sitting there outside the house of her beloved. I think we've all felt that way sometimes when we've been, had a crush on somebody and it's not requited, or maybe it is requited, but not yet. Your heart beats faster when you walk past the place where they live or work. So she's sitting outside Agatha's flat, and she sees this white thing waving out the window. She's convinced that Agatha's waving to her to invite her in, because Agatha's leaning out the window. And then I pull exactly that trick where it turns out Agatha's not waving anything at all. It's just this, and it's a piece of rubbish, right, caught in the tree, which is such a potent symbol of the foolishness. And she recognizes that, to her credit. She sort of realizes that was sort of a turning point for her when she goes from what she thinks is happening to what's really happening. And she just, I think that's a wake-up call for her. And I was very pleased to be able to, it was a case of putting lived experience and adapting it for your novel, because I could never have dreamed that up.
It's an excellent scene for sure. Moving on just a tad, I want to talk about that Edwin reveal. Because
the landlord, yeah.
I'd completely forget. There's a whole other dimension to these books. Isn't it interesting? I'd so forgotten about that. But yeah, that's a staggering reveal. Thank you.
Yeah, we get a little hint at one point that maybe he's got an interest in true crime that he doesn't really show to anyone because there's this hidden bookcase full of true crime books. And then to learn that he's actually a serial killer, like that was a staggering reveal. It was excellent. I did not see it coming and I loved it.
Thank you so much. Because, of course, when we talk about those books, we talk about Cordelia. But in fact, they're going to sort of become a double act. Not totally Holmes and Watson, but he's always going to be there whenever we need that character, whenever she needs some assistance in the books. And it was just, I struck gold when I realized that. I mean, there's a number of things, but one of the favorite things I've ever done in my life is I wrote the sentence, so anyway, it turned out Edwin was a serial killer. Like one of my favorite sentences I've ever written, which is at the beginning of a chapter, because it's just so casual, right?
Was Edwin always intended to play this kind of role, or did that occur as you were writing the book and realized she needed a little bit of assistance?
It occurred very early on, and just for the following reason. I'd actually written a novel about Edwin. He had a different name, his dog had a different name, and they lived in a different place. Basically, that was that character. And nobody wanted to publish it because he was just too unsympathetic. Like, they just didn't want a book about this guy who sort of kills people. And I thought, well, but it's like Patricia Highsmith's Tom Ripley books. It was basically on that level. Like, he's not, and I say this in the Paperback Sleuth novel, he's like not like a gloating serial killer, trophy hunting, basement full of creepy stuff serial killer. It's just like, if he thinks the world would be better off without somebody in it, or maybe if he sees some tremendous advantage for himself, which is what Tom Ripley would always do. Like, he would kill if he really needed to, if he could gain something where he felt the world would be improved by it. So he's that kind of serial killer. But people didn't like it. They just thought nobody's going to want to read this book. So, okay, fair enough. I put that book aside. But I thought that then when I was writing this, I thought, you know what? He'd be ideal as the landlord. And then there's plot stuff he can do. Because I have that sequence, my favorite bit, where Cordelia kills this guy with a laptop. This potential murderer and rapist, she kills him with her MacBook Air. And I just loved it so much. But then I had the problem of getting rid of the body. So Edwin comes out and says, oh, I suppose you'll need some help getting rid of the body.
Okay, that was interesting to me, that they didn't, at no point did they think, we will just call the police and say it was self-defense, because it was.
Well, the thing is, it's not inconceivable that Cordelia might have thought that way. But I mean, like, Edwin is just like, he's so into his own little thing, like, probably wouldn't even occur to him. Like, his procedure would be like, let's get rid of the body. And it's so much more. I mean, in these, unless you're writing a police procedure novel, what you're always trying to do is keep the police out of it, because you're not writing that kind of book. And if you get the police involved, you either have a choice of writing it in this completely fantastical way where you ignore what police procedure would actually be, or the police procedure begins to take over. And none of my books aren't police procedurals. So I'm always going to be looking for reasons to keep the cops out of it. But that was a pretty good reason, because that's the way Edwin's mind would have worked. And also, he sort of doesn't want the police to enter, he doesn't want to be on their radar at all, because although the things he's done, he's been quite good about covering his tracks, he certainly doesn't want to take any chances.
Absolutely, yeah. And, if keeping the police out of it gets me a serial killer, I'm on board.
And one of the notes from my editor editors was that they loved Edwin and the reveal, but they felt it needed a bit of setting up. And I thought, well, they're not wrong, because I'd actually felt that myself. I have a rule which is useful to all writers, which is how do you know when to accept notes from your editor? Because if you don't accept any notes, you're a bit of an idiot. But if you accept everybody's note, then that's also wrong. So my rule of thumb is, if two people independently give me the same note, like they haven't consulted, but they both give me the same note, or if the note that is given to you is something that you sort of been thinking yourself, you'd sort of kind of thought that. And I'd sort of kind of thought Edwin needs a bit more setting up. So I thought long and hard, and I came up with that thing about him having a secret collection of true crime. And it sounds like that worked for you. So I'm so pleased about that.
It did. I also think that it worked on multiple levels, because I was imagining, when we first see it, I thought that he was somehow going to be connected to Colin Cutterham rather than be his own independent serial killer.
Bad guy. Yeah.
I also thought it was very funny that Cordelia finds a false wall with a bookcase hidden behind it, and her reaction is, must be porn.
Yeah.
And because like after I finished reading it, I was like, if he's going through that much to hide these books, that's not just being embarrassed about porn, right? So I felt very vindicated. I did not guess what his real situation was, but I was glad that it was something a little more than that.
You knew something was up, which was the idea behind it. And also that section, it's an opportunity for Cordelia to do some sleuthing, because the whole procedure where she finds his secret stash of true crime was, again, we needed a bit more of her being a sleuth. So that was ideal for that.
Yeah, this is a crime fiction novel, but there are still some mysteries. What's going on with Edwin, and then also the artist that we find out who has a secret identity. Seeing both of those unravel were quite enjoyable.
Well, that's great, because I had that from a very early stage, that Cordelia would be in search of a series of British crime novels with great cover art. I'm looking around to see if I've got any here, because there is a series like that, which I mentioned, which really exists. And it's called the Boardman Bloodhound series. So I created the Sleuthhound series to be an equivalent of that. And I thought, well, who can the cover artist be? And as in all these situations, it's more fun to use an existing character if you got one that you like. And I thought, Toba Posner, because her career trajectory was ideal, that she'd have just come out of art school and be looking for that kind of work, like doing paperback covers at that time. So that was ideal. And I thought, it's going to be great, because the main problem with this book is that there wasn't a lot of crimey stuff in it initially. And so her discovery that this artist who she reveres is actually this other person was a good little reveal. So I needed things like that. So that was always in there from quite an early stage.
It also sounds, and I don't know if you can confirm or deny this, but it sounded kind of like Colin Cutterham might be being set up to be a recurring antagonist.
He wasn't conceived with that in mind, but by the time I'd finished the book, I thought he's going to have to come up again, because I don't see him just rolling over. In fact, Edwin says the threat level with Colin Cutterham, it's no worse than Amber. Right? But that doesn't suggest that it's gone away entirely. And I kind of love the sort of casual way that the way that Edwin accepts is just as part of life. You know, there's this mad, murderous gangster who may at some point erupt. Because the nice thing about Edwin is he's sort of like a bring it on. You know, like it sort of enlivens his life in the same way that a really good crossword puzzle would, which is why he's such a delightful character. And my editor was very pleased with Edwin. Like, they really liked that aspect of these books, is that they called him a South London. I've blanked on the name of the. There's a TV series about a serial killer with a guy from 6 Feet Under in it. Dexter, right? Yeah. They called him a South London Dexter. And of course, he's not like that, because Dexter is a thrill killer and in the Hannibal Lecter mode. And I made it very clear that Edwin is a serial killer in the Tom Ripley mode, which is totally different. But nonetheless, they were delighted at the notion that they got this serial killer as a kind of a bonus character in these books. And he's great. Like in the new book, he features quite a lot, because it's so fabulous, because Cordelia's unraveling this mystery, and it just not to have her just constantly thinking in her own head and telling the reader it that way. She goes down and Edwin makes hot chocolate for them. They sit and talk about it while Rain Bottle, the dog, is sort of on the floor lying on their feet. And it just brings it to life in a really good way. It's really helpful to have somebody for your hero to talk to, which other writers have discovered over the years.
It was almost a heartwarming moment. It was a heartwarming moment when Cordelia finally has someone that she can tell all of the things, like all of the papers and like dangerous situations she's been in. It was the first moment she had a confidant in the book. And so I was like, oh, yay.
And he's so non-judgmental, right? Mm-hmm. She can literally tell him anything and he'll be fine with it, which makes him a really good character from that point of view for her. The thing with Edwin, it's important to make him incredibly kind of liberal in that way, but he's still got to be kind of a bit stuck up and prissy to make him interesting. Like, you know, he's still too fond of his classical music and, things like that. I just walking that balance between him being like her super good friend who can help her out of situations and still being her pain in the ass landlord. It's really fun walking that tightrope.
Well, I definitely am looking forward to seeing how their relationship evolves as the series progresses, because now that she knows that she can confide in him and he will be that kind of non-judgmental ear, I think it's going to be really interesting.
And he's also really useful for action sequences because she's not an action hero, but he is in a strange kind of way. He is an action hero. And I do that thing in this book, which I've learned from the great thriller writer Peter O'Donnell, who created Modesty Blaze. One of the things that Peter O'Donnell used to do, which I love and do it whenever I can, is he had set up this really elaborate situation that you're really looking forward to seeing happen. And then he does 180, does something else completely. So in this, I did the bit where Edwin is all ready for the bad guys to attack the house. And he's got all these preparations, all these weapons. He's got all these devices ready. And you're like, yeah, you bring it on. And of course, something completely different happens. And I've always loved that as a reader, and I really enjoyed doing it as a writer.
I felt a little bit bad for Edwin, though, because he was so looking forward to that. And then he just,
it's
it
true.
gets sidestepped.
He's disappointed. Listen, I can't have too much praise. I just wonder, did you like the sequence where she's being chased and the climax in the church? Did all that work?
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
especially having spent a whole book like ratcheting up the tension, we get to the scene that we'd been waiting for, and then just having all of that happening. It was great.
Yeah, it just from that point on, it's just like constant action, and it feels really satisfying after all of the time, like Lily was saying, all of the time that we've spent feeling increasingly more tense. It's nice to have that release and have that action scene.
That was, yeah. The book was always, the structural issue with the book was that all this great stuff happened at the end, and it was putting things earlier to tell the reader, that the cavalry is coming in terms of the big narrative rewards. And the only other thing that I will mention, I don't know if it's of any interest or whether you want to include it, is that the other influence on this book was Fleabag, because that was an entirely new kind of female character, and that certainly informed my view of Cordelia and the way that she's just so unapologetically herself, which I really liked.
I loved that about her. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that about Cordelia. I will say I tried to give Fleabag a watch at one point, and I just found the main character too unlikable, which was not a problem for Cordelia for me. So
I got the balance right with Cordelia, because that is the problem with that character, is potential unlikability. So that's a very interesting result. Thank heavens that I managed to square that circle.
Yeah, I mean, as I've said, I actually really loved Cordelia. She was a horrible person, but I still loved her, and I loved reading about her and reading what she got up to.
That's very, very promising. And I really hope the book goes over well, because I'm deep into the next one, and it's so much easier writing the next one because I know the characters now and I know the world. And the first one was a big struggle to sort of get the engine started, if you know what I mean. And this one, it's up and running already, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. So fingers crossed. We don't know what's going to happen exactly next, but I've got Cordelia, I've got Edwin and Rainbottle, and the little world they operate in, and I'm really having fun with it.
Before we let you go, would you tell our listeners where they can keep track of your wonderful books and projects on the internet?
So I'm not great on social media, but I am on social media. I'm on Instagram, I am on Facebook, and I am on Twitter. And I will use all of those platforms to announce stuff, but Twitter would be the best one. If you can find Andrew Cartmel on Twitter, and I'm the Andrew, there are several Andrew Cartmels, and there's various variant spellings, including the guy who does the Eurovision Song Contest, who's a very nice guy, but his name is similar to mine, but not the same. But I'm the Andrew Cartmel with a cute little cat peering over his shoulder. Once you find that, preferably on Twitter, because that's probably the space I most use for publicizing my books. And please buy them in a bricks and mortar bookstore, a physical bookstore if you can. But if you want to order them from Amazon, that'll work really well too.
Well, great. Thank you so much for joining us and answering our silly questions. Yes.
I do have one more thing, because I always forget to say this, but I've got a radio show where I play music. And if any of your listeners would like to come and hear that, the thing to search for is it's called Vinyl Detective Radio. And the best place to look for it, it's on a couple of internet radio stations, but the easiest one to play old shows and to catch it on is called Reclaimed Radio. So Reclaimed Radio, Vinyl Detective Radio, and do have a listen if you get a chance. I hope you enjoy it.
And we will make sure to link to that in the show notes so that listeners can easily find it.
Yeah, that would help. To put a link in would be really fantastic. Thank you.
Great. I can't wait to listen. I can't wait to read more about Cordelia and what she gets up to next.
I might do some more writing after I've spoken to you guys. I've done my day's stint, but I think I might do a little bit more. We'll see.
What's your daily goal? You said you have a word goal for yourself, right?
It depends on how imminent a deadline is. And the thing is, the next book I've got to write is the vinyl detective novel, which needs to be done quite quickly, like by the autumn. But when I sat down, we had this, I spoke to my publisher, we agreed this. When I sat down, I had this strong impulse to write the next Paperback Sleuth instead. And when you've got that strong impulse, it's very foolish if you're a creative artist to ignore it. It's just not a good idea because you're going to do your best work when you feel like that. And why would you repress not do your best work? So I've been madly writing. In answer to your question, I've been writing 2,000 words a day, which is a lot. But I figured out how much I'd have to write to do this Paperback Sleuth novel and still being with a chance of doing the vinyl detective according to schedule. And so that's why I'm doing 2,000 words a day, which is a lot. If you did 2,000 words every day of the year, you'd write 8 full-length novels a year.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's a lot. But just from a pure craft point of view, it's worth knowing that there's always some cutting to be done. So a novel that was 8 books a year was on the assumption that you write a novel that's 90,000 words, which it is. The trouble is, to write a 90,000 word novel, I probably have to write 105,000 words because there's a certain amount of wastage. So 2,000 words a day would probably be about 7 novels a year, but it's still a lot. Obviously, I don't intend to do that every day of the year, but if I can do that just for a few months, I can get on top of both these series. And also, I want to get this book written and done because then I've done the next one in the series and it's there and I've sort of really got the series rolling.
So can I ask what your release schedule is going to be? Is it going to be a book a year, whether that's Final Detective or Paperback Sleuth, or is it going to be...
Yeah, we could have done that, but then I think then that would be 1 book in each series every 2 years, which is too long to wait. We considered 18 months. But I said I can do 2 books a year, so let's do 1 book in each series every year. So we're looking at sort of early in 2024 for both books, like something like February and June. I'm not saying those will be the dates, but something like that. It's like February Final Detective, June Paperback Sleuth. Something like that would be a good goal to aim for.
Well, that's good to know for our calendar, so I can make sure to.
No, we're not going to write that
some...
down. It was an example. We're not going to hold you to it.
Something close to that.
Yeah.
Please, I'd love to talk to you about both books, and if you guys are up for it, it's really useful to me.
Yeah, well,
Always.
we won't hold you to those exact dates, but I will put something on put two slots on the calendar for you.
That'd be fabulous. Thank you so much.
And thank you again for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
That's what I was going to say. Took the words out of my mouth.
My cat didn't make horrible, unworldly, ghastly noises.
Next time, fingers crossed.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We are on Twitter and Instagram at FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and follow us wherever your podcasts live.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye.
Bye.